On the 27th of April 1991, 4 vintage steam locomotives of the East Lancashire Railway Company made history. They opened a railway line to Rawtenstall, Lancashire, for the second time in 150 years. Railways aren't reborn every day, but there are daily similar events throughout the nation. And it's often history which people choose to celebrate. It matters to them, and they embellish it with all the trappings of the civic occasion. Sarah Tanner, head of history at Southlands High School, Chorley, is here to gather material for a study unit. Here too is her young friend, Joshua. Like all of us, Joshua cannot escape the past. It's everywhere, from the insignia of the mayor to the railway on which he rides. Unlike the mayor of Bury, Joshua has still to discover his own place in time. Like other children, he needs to know about his family, his community, his country, the puzzling world he lives in. And today, with its random images of past and present, is perhaps more puzzling than most. In time, of course, Joshua will have the skills and knowledge to understand it. But just now, history is quite a handful.
There's the river again, Joshua. That's right.
Out of the window is the landscape of history, images which can be ordered and interpreted as part of the history of Britain. This is some of the source material of the past which a child must comprehend. And ahead, a myriad other fragments await his understanding.
Underneath the bridge.
National curriculum history can help children develop this understanding and bring order to the past. It does it through attainment targets and through programs of study. The 3 attainment targets are about the key elements of historical knowledge, understanding and skills needed to interpret the past. Attainment Target 1 has 3 strands. It's about change and continuity, cause and consequence, and knowing about key features of historical situations. Attainment Target 3 deals with the skills involved in handling sources which are mainly from the period being studied. Attainment Target 2 builds on some of the skills developed in AT3. It's about the different ways the past has been interpreted. But these targets can't be studied in isolation. They're only developed through the programs of study. Each program of study consists of general requirements and different study units. Each study unit has historical content, which is approached through the attainment targets.
I can see the light.
The rest of this program looks at 3 teachers whose current practice includes aspects of national curriculum history. They realize they must adapt and change in response to the new requirements. But for all 3, their own experience, or the locality, provides a possible starting point. At Moscroft Primary School in Knowsley, timelines relate the recent past to the child's experience, which is where Key Stage 1 begins. Here at Moscroft, which is on the outskirts of Liverpool, parents and teachers have worked together to build resources, historical artifacts, written materials, oral evidence. And in Class 1, teacher Anne Stevens will use her own history to introduce the concepts of continuity and change.
Right, now this morning when we came into school, Kelly came over to me and said, Mrs. Stevens, are you on that photograph there? Do you think I'm on that photograph?
Yeah.
Do you?
Yeah.
Where do you think I am? Just point. I'm not on that photograph because that photograph's far older than I am. But I am on that photograph down there. That's me there. But it's still a black and white photograph. Is there anything on that picture that you can see that we've got in our classroom?
Pictures. No.
Pictures, right.
Yeah, no blackboards.
A blackboard, that's right. Do I look like that teacher?
No.
Now, look at the clothes of the children in there. What kind of clothes do we wear for school? A school uniform. Do you think they've got a uniform on? They all look different, don't they? They all look different.
In Programme 4, we return to Moscroft to see how they've planned for progression in the single study unit of Key Stage 1. Only a few miles away, Mike Rothwell of Belthorne School uses not childhood, but his local environment for Key Stage 2 history.
Right, this morning we've come to look at some cottages at Westview. What we're going to do is look at these cottages at Westview, and then we're going to move on to some younger, more modern houses just up there on James Street and compare what you find here to what you find up there.
Key Stage 2 has 9 study units, of which 1 must be a local study. Mike Rothwell has always valued local resources, and he'll adapt his past practice to the new curriculum. By looking at local houses of different periods, his pupils will gain skills of observation, recording and measurement.
Same size. So that must have been enlarged. Could have been. Yeah. 11.7 metres, Duncan.
We're interested in building up skills, observational skills, which are not only linked to history, but are cross-curricular things as well. Obviously, the children have had experience. They had the required skills to make interpretations of what they saw. For instance, the older settlement was designed with work in mind. The later Victorian houses were designed merely as dwellings. So that was one of the significant points.
Put that. It's more modern. What's the roof made out of? I don't know.
One of the problems with local history is the parochial nature, introverted, looking at just a little place where you live. So the rationale behind the period after we came back was to look at similar cottages but spread out over a wider area of, first of all, Lancashire, and then looking at a particular building in Yorkshire, so that the children are not left with the impression that in 1815 everybody in England was a handloom weaver, and that I would further develop this. Let's have a look at this cottage, which is in Yorkshire. What is the difference between the cottages we've looked at around Belthorne and this particular cottage?
They haven't had as many windows.
Well, our cottages haven't got as many windows. Is there another difference?
Those are upstairs.
Those are upstairs. Now, all the cottages we've got in Belthorne, the loom shop windows are usually downstairs. Why was that?
Because they had to keep the cotton down from stopping it breaking.
They had to keep the cotton down. What we're trying to do is we've got some physical evidence outside the school, but physical evidence is no good on its own. It doesn't stand. So although the children were able to say, well, these cottages were possibly used by handloom weavers, they hadn't got the written evidence, the primary source material, to finally prove that statement. And the census material that was being used both on computer and the facsimiles was evidence to back up the assumptions that are made through fieldwork.
Right, we'll do female and males.
In using a range of activities, Mike Rothwell is meeting some of the other requirements of the programmes of study, the use of IT and different methods of inquiry and communication.
7 males. 7 males? 26.
Much of this work can be linked with other areas of the curriculum, such as mathematics or design. Throughout the topic, individual pupils too can begin to develop a sense of chronology. For example, using coins to create a timeline of queens and kings. And from local beginnings, Mike Rothwell is concerned to progress into the major themes of history.
I would be looking for some figure, some event, which was of a more national significance, which affected Belthorne, but the rest of Great Britain in the same sort of way. For example, this century, Darwin, which is a couple of miles away, was visited by Gandhi in 1931 or thereabouts, in response to a Quaker invitation to see the conditions, the unemployment as a result of the Indian boycott of Lancashire textiles. Because the Indian boycott had a disastrous effect on Belthorne. And Gandhi was actually brought up here to see what effect it was doing. He wasn't entirely impressed, incidentally.
Back in the railway world of Sarah Tanner, the trains are notable by their absence. This other branch of the East Lancashire Railway closed in the 1970s and probably won't reopen. But it does offer a good point of departure for a history unit. The viaduct dominates Helmshaw Hire Mill, and their histories are closely intertwined. Sarah has decided to use Helmshaw Mill in the context of the study unit Expansion, Trade and Industry to help her Key Stage 3 pupils relate local events to national trends.
Obviously we're here this morning, we're going to have a look at the impact of the railway here at Helmshaw. So we're going to start to look at some sources that deal really with the transport situation in this area.
I think if you're going to give children a sense of history, the place to do that is actually where it lived, where it breathed and where it happened. And initially what we did was we looked at the resources available to us and the availability of actual physical sites to take the children to. And so Helmshaw being relatively close to us was obviously, you know, ideally suited.
So what do the sources actually tell us about the difficulties of transport in the early 1800s?
Roads are generally bad though, but they were worse in some cases, depending on who owned them, didn't they?
Yeah,
It says it's up to the middle of the wheels, isn't it?
yeah. This is our first one now.
The canals were well built. You could end up having different lengths of canals, different widths of canals.
And it was unreliable, and the weather conditions were bad as well.
That was the same with the roads, wasn't it? I mean,
Sarah's activities link both the attainment targets and the unit's content. Her pupils are using sources for background information. That's obviously AT3. And at the same time, in looking at the local impact of the Industrial Revolution, they're studying causation, which is AT1.
Right, so having gone through the evidence that we've gone through this morning and looked at the sources fairly carefully, it's obvious there were major transport difficulties. If you consider that, it seems very strange that somebody would want to come and build a mill in the location that we're in today. There must have been some reason why this site was actually chosen.
Water wheel, built out of cast iron and fine English oak. And there it is, William Turner's power source.
When we went outside, the aim was for the children to look at the back wall of the old mill. There is evidence there very, very clearly of the sort of growth that the mill underwent.
Bricked in arch dirt, yeah.
And the children can see literally the railway abuts to the end of the mill, and obviously from the evidence they get it wasn't there initially.
So can you not see it's been knocked off at end? There's a cavity in there and took...
I reckon that happened.
The evidence there is very clear for the motivation of a manufacturer in the 1840s with major transport problems on his hands, yet a growing market out there that he was attempting to reach. Privately, he wanted the railway. Publicly, he made noises against. He then got compensation from that and restructured his mill, which was the evidence that the children see at the back of the mill.
Armed with physical evidence, time now to look at the different ideas and attitudes of people in the past. Again, an aspect of AT1.
The aim was to try and get the children to ask questions for themselves, to sort through information, to interpret that information and to come up with answers for themselves.
William Turner set it up so that the money from the land was put into new equipment for his mill.
Right, so he wins always round, so what you're saying is he's relatively pleased. If we can try to come to some kind of conclusion about all the things that we've looked at through the course of the day, what kind of lessons can we learn from what we've seen today about railways now in the 1990s? Michael?
We can compare their problems to the problems we've got today. Like compare like what they had with the trains to our traffic problems and how they solved it.
You're talking road traffic?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Personally, I think that you can look at a locality and you can take that to a regional level, a national level, and certainly environmentally now, a global and an international level. Any local study can provide you with a springboard into major national or international issues.
May 1991. A welcoming band of Key Stage 2 students is preparing for a visitor to the Dales Junior School, Tamworth. The visitor is Queen Victoria, and the preparations are only 148 years too late. Throughout the first half of the spring term, these young people have been studying Victorian Britain, spurred by the knowledge that Victoria did indeed visit Tamworth in 1843. And today, the whole school project should reach a fitting climax with the Queen's arrival. Rachel Davis is the history coordinator. She too has a visitor in the form of history inspector Andy Reid. Topic-based work like this Victorian project has always been a great strength in primary teaching. But how has Rachel translated this into the framework of the national curriculum?
Well, obviously, as you know, we work a 2-year cycle of topics, and what we've tried to do is actually look at ways of fitting in the 9 history study units within our present framework.
No, we want ancient Greece with the older one.
We've had a staff meeting on actually looking at where we could possibly put these 9 history study units.
The only problem with the food and farming that came about this year was the timing, wasn't it?
Obviously, in our school, we've got a very strong ethos of topic work and thematic-based approach, bringing all curriculum areas into topics. That was a concern, particularly at first, with some of the staff. They felt that with some of these topics, you wouldn't be able to bring in all the curriculum areas. However, with our Victorian Britain project, we've shown that we could actually do that.
If you're also building on from the 1930s project as well, the local history one, done this with Y3 and 4, will tie in nicely with Victorian Britain and the bias we've got on Tamworth in that as well.
Exploration and encounters, I think, is more applicable for the older ones because of the mapping skills.
That's terrific because, of course, it is one of the challenges of national curriculum history in Key Stage 2 to build on the best traditions of integrated theme work, topic work in the primary school. So working together, you've introduced that greater depth and rigour whilst at the same time preserving the links across the curriculum.
Just going back, chronologically speaking.
Right, so we have these 3 alternative plans that you've prepared for your colleagues. And I noticed that here, perhaps we could just turn this around so that the camera can see it. You've identified the history study units, the core and the supplementary units across Key Stage 2. And you've indicated that some of them will be broad themes or broad topics, others will be focus themes, and some will be specific themes.
Yes, we'd see a broad theme project as being where we bring in most of the curriculum areas.
Right.
A focus theme would be one where we used 3 or 4 curriculum areas within the topic, and the specific theme would be one where we just had one curriculum area, which obviously in the case of explorations and encounters would be history, and it would be supported by up to one other curriculum area.
Let's move on to think about the unit on Victorian Britain itself. The way you developed this topic on Victoria and Tamworth, in fact, involved taking a local history supplementary unit on Victoria and Tamworth and organising it end-on with a core unit on Victorian Britain, so that the local unit led into the core unit. Yes. Do you feel you've got that balance about right?
Yes, I do actually. I mean, we really did carefully plan the local history project. So we've actually explored the questions, ideas and content we might use, the learning activities and the links with the attainment targets, and potential curriculum links in other curriculum areas and resources.
So you used the local history unit really as a way in to the much more abstract content of the Victorian Britain unit. Tell me about the unit itself, the experiences for the children that resulted in these marvellous displays that you've put up around the school.
Well, we actually found out that Queen Victoria did actually come to Tamworth, so we thought that would be quite a nice starting point. So that sort of initiated the children's excitement about this person who was actually coming to visit us. Then we actually went on to look at the evidence of Queen Victoria and the Victorians within Tamworth.
Right.
We looked at evidence of buildings that were Victorian, looking at dates on them, and we looked at changes within the town.
What makes you think there might have been houses before?
Because of the chimneys and...
Right, the chimneys, yeah.
There's a picture in Tamworth Library of the Golden Jubilee, and it shows how the street looked at that time.
There's no evidence on there at all for lampposts. Have a look there, you see, there's one there, isn't there? Is there one in that picture there?
And then we looked at the local censuses to find out about people living in the Victorian times. We found out about names of people, how many people lived in families, what sort of illnesses there were around at the time.
I was too young.
That's right, only 10 years old.
I wonder why they didn't take photos and what they drew them. Because they didn't have cameras. They did.
The next one, can you find it on the next one?
That's it.
Now, I can see a lot of references looking at the planning matrix to Attainment Target 3, and also a good many to Attainment Target 1. Not so many to Attainment Target 2, but it's, I think, very important. It's really central to what history is all about. And I wondered, looking at this, whether you'd found that a bit of a difficulty.
Yes, I mean, out of all of the attainment targets, I think we found Attainment Target 2 quite difficult to actually get at exactly what was meant by it.
Right. Now, one possibility, just thinking back to what you've been saying about the development of the topic, the visit to the Black Country Museum, there's an example of a version of history, a presentation of history. Yes. One gets lots of very stereotypical versions of the Victorian period from, for example, Christmas cards and, the Quality Street tin. Yes. Which in many ways is quite a distorted one. And what one could do, perhaps, is to ask the question, does that version of history match with the version of the Victorian period that you get from your textbooks?
It so happens that the school's recreation of Victoria's visit could itself provide a useful source for AT2. Teacher Lynn Jones enacts Victoria in Widow's Weeds. It's an image we all recognise. But in 1843, Albert was still very much alive. In other words, images such as these are a good opportunity to question our traditional interpretations of the past. Royalty came to Kenilworth too, but not in today's story. Our Kenilworth tale concerns the bringing together of 4 Coventry teachers in pursuit of interdisciplinary cooperation.
That's a fine bit of the castle. Yes, this tower was built by the Earl of Leicester in the 1570s for Queen Elizabeth I's visit.
Among those planning to invade the castle are 2 teachers from Ernsford Grange School, Coventry. Roger Long teaches KS3 history, and Tony Parkinson is responsible for English.
It's got tremendous atmosphere, though, hasn't it, this castle?
Yeah, but the problem strikes me is that the atmosphere now is very different from the atmosphere of a medieval castle at that time.
That's right, and it's difficult to get the children to disentangle the parts that were built later.
This is Leicester's building, this side, and then this bit over here is John of Gaunt's Hall, or part of it, the connecting bit with the Tudor buildings.
Meanwhile, inside the castle, cooperation is also the aim of Stoke Park School English teacher Kim Hopper and Pat Ludgett, the historian.
Well, it's an interesting building, but we can't really use it because none of this would have been here during the siege.
In 1266, Kenilworth suffered the longest ever siege in British medieval history, a full 6 months. It's this siege which will form part of the study units to be developed by the 4 teachers. Which is why today they all plan to consult English Heritage Education Officer Liz Hollinshead, determined to explore Kenilworth's educational potential.
What we need to establish first of all really is where you're up to in your history programme. I mean, I assume you're coming here to do something on medieval realms, yes?
Yes,
That's right.
yes. We're doing up to the part about the growth of Parliament, and we're going to use the castle to bring that to life. And so what we thought we'd do is talk about Magna Carta, talk about Simon's Great Council and the origins of Parliament and the erosion of the King's power, and then bring it down to a local site, make it personal to them, their area, this happened here.
So what are you planning, Roger?
Well, from the historical point of view, we'd like to bring children along, really to focus on the Great Siege of Kenilworth of 1266. It was a remarkable event. And the first thing we'd want to get them to do is to focus on the castle and its defensive capability. But also we'd like to look at what it was like to live in a castle.
And what about the English people? Where are you up to? What do you want to do next in your programmes of study?
Well, what we wanted to try to do was to get pupils producing work which makes them direct it towards different audiences for different purposes.
And how about you, Tony?
I'd like to see some talking and listening coming out of this. And at the end of this, I think I could possibly finish up with the radio broadcast, which would be nice. And then I'll take the writing from there, maybe newspaper writing, I think.
Have you ever thought of doing history in collaboration with another discipline subject teacher?
Yes, in the past, our history department has just really collaborated with geography, and we can still do that, of course, under the national curriculum, but we're also looking at other links now as well. For example, links with RE, with the work on the Roman Empire, and we've got links with technology and expansion, trade and industry, and also links with science in crowns, parliaments and peoples.
Having learnt about the siege of Kenilworth, the pupils arrive to study the site.
So you've all got good ideas of what you want out of the visit. What exactly do you want to do on site?
We wanted to give the pupils a problem, like why did the siege last so long, and then use that for some history stimulation, which is led by me but has an English input with Kim.
Yes.
And then for Kim to lead a particular group of activities, and I do a history feed into that.
Now, the water defences worksheet and the weapons worksheet.
So you're collaborating straight away because on site, nearly always children will be taking notes. They'll be taking them back to school, editing them, redrafting them, and then presenting them in some sort of way. And that is exactly part of what's asked for in the inquiry and communications bit of the history national curriculum. But it fits in spot on into English as well.
Right, this is your building, Jill, so you have to get in it round the side.
So, when you're looking at the keep, when you're trying to identify which building it is, you're going to be looking for a building which doesn't have doors and doesn't have windows on the ground floor.
And the wall, we can't get up. There's no windows there either, so I think it's the keep.
The walls are quite thick.
How thick do you think they are?
More than about 2 metres. Because there's probably been floors right up there, haven't there? Yeah, the walls over there as well.
Let me tell you what you're going to do on this one. The king tried to attack the castle from boats on the lake, but he failed. Put a tick next to the weapons he would find most useful and mark on your water defences plan the places you would think he would have used them from.
The siege tower won't be very good because they have to get it up to the wall, and if they can't get it up to the wall because of all the water, and the water would leak in there.
What about spears? We couldn't use them because they only go to 30 metres and got the mirror and that around there, so they wouldn't be that good.
The hand-to-hand fighting would be out of the question because they would hardly get into the castle.
The castle people had not much, limited supply of weapons and food.
Yes.
That made them weaken.
So inside the castle they've not got to just worry about food, have they?
Yeah.
After the siege, Pat and Kim can assess the rewards of cooperation.
The stuff outside the walls, that went well. They asked some really intelligent questions. I didn't have to feed it to them at all in a way that I thought I would have to.
I think one of the most important things for the English side that's come out of this has been to do with the speaking and listening. The amount of speaking and listening that's gone on with the children in the groups this afternoon has been phenomenal.
Yeah.
They've needed to ask advice from us for various different reasons, but they've also had to actually listen to each other because it is quite complicated, the knowledge that they've had to try to involve in the activities that they've done. So I'm very pleased with that.
Why did the siege go on so long? Because the horses, they had more meat.
What I really liked was the way that, although one of the activities was history-led and the other was English-led, there was bits of history in the English one and English in the history one.
That's right. They were so intermingled that I think either of us really could have led it.
And I think English has certainly helped me to make it come more alive. And hopefully the history has built into some of your work in the same way. And perhaps we could do the same thing over that Irish potato famine exercise, and we could start working on that.
Yes.
What sort of... I could look at the play and pick out the historical references.
Trip to Ireland.
A trip to Ireland, yeah. And we could start with potato.
Yes.
And we could start to think about what I could feed in there.
These bronze heads at the British Museum are among the more spectacular remains of the Kingdom of Benin. This African civilization reached its peak between 1400 and 1600. Benin is one of the non-European supplementary study units at Key Stage 2, for which teachers can choose both the focus and the content. So, these Enfield teachers are exploring ways to develop the two units of African history. One from the comparative wealth of Egyptian sources, the other from the more fragmentary remains of Benin.
So you've got an A3 sheet, which has the columns which we're going to work to, and the evaluation sheet is, if you like, a sort of additional bit that you could use.
Working in the museum's education room, history advisor Kate Morse uses a planning matrix to turn statutory requirements into a scheme of work. The planning process is the same for both units.
So initially, what we're trying to do is establish, for the first part of the task, the focus of the study.
Establishing a focus makes the content more manageable and identifies the areas to be taught in depth. But what provides the focus for Benin?
And you have images of that king, men holding his arms on either side, gives you a feeling of just exactly what that power is.
I would find that a very difficult starting point with children. And I liked your idea of starting with Nigeria today and perhaps starting from a geographical point of view.
So basically, we're talking about power.
So that would change our focus. Rather than the whole group's focus being kingship, the whole group's focus would be power and the power structure.
Next, identify some key questions or themes. These will relate to the ATs and reflect the requirements for the unit, including, in this case, the use of archaeological evidence.
I wondered about if you could ask where the king lived, what the palace looked like. To me, that's something I would like to know. Something about the palace chiefs and the way it was run.
I think we've got to look at the sort of religious influence on society. What things does he bring into play which sort of keeps him in that position? The way he sort of controls his artisans, the way he controls his sort of craftsmen.
So things like you've got women in kingship, role of the king,
Power source, how it was gained,
family life,
life of the king, any duties, marriage,
foreign relationships.
The next stage looks at the resources and plans the related teaching activities. Again, the grid helps to identify links between the attainment targets and the content.
So what are we looking for? Something, anything to do with the palace or the king.
All those buildings and maps here.
Oh, right, so where's Benin? Oh, there it is.
Right, this is the front of the palace, I think.
Yeah, Ober's palace.
And this is a modern
Modern
building, and that says the modern entrance to Ober's palace there.
Oh, so that's the comparison between the
yes.
two.
Each key stage should give a chance to explore links with other subjects, and a matrix will allow these to be identified. The matrix, too, offers a final check. For instance, the group planning Egypt are looking at their coverage of ATs. They've even used comic books as a source, helping pupils to understand some of the different interpretations of ancient Egypt.
And Tintin?
Yes.
What does he do? Go to Egypt?
Yes, he has an adventure.
But there are other requirements they need to check.
How about the pesque formula?
I think the main focus covers that quite nicely. You've got families and homes, and we're concentrating on the rich and the poor.
Do you think that we've covered the chronology adequately?
That was difficult, but we said that all along, things like food, toys, pastimes, we'll be making comparisons all the time.
What you're saying is that the nature of the evidence determines the way in which...
Planning with a matrix helps these teachers relate the attainment targets to the requirements of the study unit. This approach has benefits for every key stage. At Primit High School, Cone, they're developing a core unit on crowns, parliaments and peoples. These Civil War characters have been enlisted as a dramatic resource. Later on, we'll see how these individuals, brought to life by the Civil War Society, are used to good effect to help children understand the many issues of the Civil War. But the department will wish to use many other resources. Head of Humanities, Chris Morris, has introduced his colleagues to the planning matrix.
Right.
National curriculum in 30 minutes, okay? Easy. The first thing that we did was to bring the people who are going to be teaching and are responsible for the unit together. So it was Kath, Vicky and myself sat down to try and plan it with a purpose. The other thing that struck me, I don't know about you as you looked at the unit, is that the title itself, The Making of the UK. I think from inference, we've really got to emphasise the British aspect of the unit. It's not just a history. I must admit, we all had some trepidation about doing this particular unit. We're quite good on doing the Industrial Revolution, and the medieval realms we've covered for years. But it was the political aspects of this that didn't really excite us. And we've had to think long and hard about how we make this unit as interesting to youngsters as possible, because if you haven't got the interest and enjoyment, we don't feel that they will learn. But increasingly as we've got onto it, we feel that we can excite through looking at persecution, through looking at the ideas of rebellion, through looking at what it was like for the country to be made together and how a country knit together. If I jot everything down, we'll do it in fairly rough form. Okay. The key considerations of planning any unit, really, I think from a staff point of view, is you've got to identify exactly what you think are the priorities for that unit. So it's the learning objectives. Now, in terms of the national curriculum, you've got the framework of the programme of study and the attainment targets, and you've got to marry those two together, and that should give you a framework for establishing what your learning objectives and ultimately outcomes for the pupils ought to be.
Perhaps Henry stroke Elizabeth, because we're looking at the kingdom monarchs as a whole, their power of Parliament.
And then from there,
we're looking at how the balance of power changed, aren't we?
So we're looking at the whole of the Tudors. Okay. So those are the books we've got on that section. Those are the history books. We're very keen, and we always have been, of making sure that history is not seen as a subject in a vacuum. We want to use the resources in as wide a way as possible. Now, resources, we mean, obviously, books we already have in stock. The cupboard was rather bare. We only got one textbook, which covers the period. We've got all textbooks. And at first, let's throw those away. But increasingly, we're going to use those old textbooks. Even if we just use them to cut them up and use them as illustrations. But we're quite we're keen on not throwing anything away up here, and we're making sure that we use everything we've got. So we shall use the old material. But once we've done a little audit within our department, we're then deciding, well, let's look a little bit further afield. So we started to contact other members of staff. We looked, for example, at the music teacher and how they could contribute to the units.
We could actually, if we get the orchestra together, we could perhaps get them all to play and perform some of the music too, the whole of the year, or half of the year or something like that, in the hall.
Well, that'd be a great idea. We focus particularly on the arts, but we've even gone as far as talking to science people as well, to try and see what the material they cover in their national curriculum units can help us, and how we obviously can help them. See, those would be useful because we're interested in contrasting one period with another. But principally, we started talking to other members of staff because there is expertise, not necessarily historical, but we can use the artistic, we can use the creative, we can use the mathematical and the scientific. So our first step, really, is to look from within. But then we're trying to widen it out a little bit. We're very keen to use the museum service. We're extremely keen to get involved with people with a specialism who could help us fill a particular need we might have. Could be on the Civil War, for example.
The size of everything, too, I think they find surprising. The actual amount of material they wore, or like the pike down here, the actual size of everything, and it gives them an idea just how long these things were. I mean, it's not an original, but at least they can see it coming all the way down here, 16 foot long.
They could actually stand by the side of it to get an idea of the length, couldn't they?
Yes, they could indeed. But it's still an exhibition, and although a lot of original material, they can't handle a lot of it. But there are other things I'd like you to have a look at in here. Have a seat.
Well, this will do for starters.
Yeah, well, it makes a change. A lot of this material you can borrow. Let's look at a couple of things. Documents for a start. Now, you can't read the original, but they do transcriptions for you as well. And then down here...
that's ideal. Can we take this into school?
Oh, yes, yeah.
Again, this is ideal because it fits in perfectly with the attainment target, which is the use of evidence. The Civil War Society can be regarded as a stunt or a gimmick, but the impact of the Civil War people walking through the door outweighs many, many times me walking through the door and say, turn to page 56 or look at these documents. But it's a stimulus as much as anything else.
Yes, young man.
Do you believe in divine rights to kings?
Divine right of kings? It smacks of Catholicism to me, sir. We have cleansed this country now of Catholicism, and I believe that with this Henrietta coming back and this divine right of kings, Catholicism will come yet again, sir, into this country. No, I do not agree with it. I am a good...
We're continually trying to get youngsters to ask questions. Well, why did the Civil War spread up into the Lancashire area? What were the effects on ordinary people? Did everyone agree that there should be a battle? And so on. So we believe that learning will take place much more effectively if youngsters can set up their own line of inquiry.
All the provisions are there.
Why do you wear so many petticoats?
Because I don't have to work. The more money you have, the more petticoats you wear. I have a dress that's fairly modern. As I said, my husband only allows me 2 dresses a year. This is 6 months old at least.
Would you pay to hide somebody in your house from the King's Army if it came to that?
Indeed I would, madam. It'd be right and just to do so. Any man that stands beside...
So we're hoping to get 2 things out of the Civil War Society. We've had some difficulty with Attainment Target 2, looking for an interpretation of history, an interpretation of the past. And they provide that, as well at the same time, being a source of evidence.
To anybody.
We're also keen on using the views of current historians, contemporary historians, and to show youngsters that we might have 2 history books, but even 2 historians, learned historians, can say 2 different things. And that the past is not always cut, dried and clear, and many of them do think there's got to be a right answer, that history is because, but really to try and broaden it out a little bit. And again, it's back to inquiry. Now, so far between us, we've been looking at the background. And in the background, we've got an idea of, well, some of the key events. This morning, we saw 4 characters. And those 4 characters told us their impression of what was going on at the time. In a way, we will be quite deliberate in our attempts to make sure there is a balance in our material, that we are not just covering all male activities and fighting and male invention and so on. So deliberately, we shall seek out the role of women in society at that time. Which counties paid the ship tax?
The coast, because they needed it more so.
Right, why didn't...
on the coast.
We try and set up a range of opportunities for youngsters. Again, we'll involve special needs department in the preparation of some tasks, but equally, for the exceptionally able, we'll try and think of more research, open-ended tasks, so that we give an opportunity for more enrichment rather than just extension. And that is not a total departure from what we've done in the past.
Because they won't have as much money to buy things.
Right. So, cause of the Civil War, if you look at the top, I suppose we said there are some political, some economic and some religious. Now, when war broke out in 1642, people had to decide whether to support king or parliament.
They'd be against it, wouldn't they, like, because Catholic. Yeah, so...
Scottish noblemen. I don't know, because some control over Scotland. I'd say Parliament. Parliament, yeah.
But if he's supporting the divine right of the king, it should be king.
Well, why don't we change the divine right of the king to parliament then as well?
Well, if we put KMP.
Yeah.
Pat Harrison, Senior Humanities Advisor for Knowsley, has been working with Mosscroft Primary School. She's there to develop progression at Key Stage 1.
Chaos 1 is very important. Very young children need to understand that everybody has a history, including them. And the difficulty that teachers will have in planning KS1 is that there is only one history study unit. And there are 3, maybe 4 classes that are going to be implementing history. So that unless teachers very carefully get together and plan for progression and continuity, there would be a great danger of repetition in that all the teachers have to study changing pupils' lives, changing the adults around them, Britain since 1945, a period of history outside of living memory. So that element of planning is absolutely vital.
What do you think a baby needs?
At the first step, they were looking at artefacts which would be familiar to them. So there were artefacts that matched the baby, the teenager and the senior citizen. And all of the artefacts there, they would have met at some point. Or most of them they may have met. They may not have met the false teeth, I don't know. But they would have met those artefacts in their life. And what they're doing there is recognising the changes in people's lives. So the kind of time conventions which the teacher was dealing with was then and now, past and present, today and in the past. They're recognising continuity and change.
Earrings. Anything else?
Lipstick.
Lipstick. What would you use lipstick for?
To put it on the lips to make it look nice.
To make them look nice, yeah.
The next stage in the second classroom was continuing that theme, recognising changes in people's lives. And we were looking at 30s, 60s and now. So that what they're looking at is continuity and change. People have always ironed clothes during that period. How they've ironed them has depended on changes in technology. So again, they're recognising change in people's life, but we're building in, putting things in chronological order. So that's a more challenging activity. It builds in progression.
Which one do you think was the oldest out of these 3? Why do you think that one's the oldest?
It's because these are got
Instead of looking at the 3 irons now, I'm going to look at 3 pictures.
Again, if teachers can't actually access artefacts, there's no reason why they can't use photographs of artefacts. So they were doing a similar exercise, but there were more artefacts. There were 3 stages.
The oldest one. Why do you think that one's the oldest?
Because it's trusty and...
Most primary schools have always had mixed ability classes, but we've never had to particularly home in on which level a child was working at. Now, I think there's a great danger that teachers may, because of these external forces, start to level children. Now, I would be completely opposed to that. All children should be exposed to the different levels of questioning, but then they'll hear other children's responses, and that will access that level to them, and they will learn through that.
Yours on in the order. Well, that'd be hard in bed, wouldn't it, that?
Right, children, what I want you to do, first of all, is just choose a picture. Any picture, one that you're interested in. Well, that didn't take long, Tony, did it? You sure that's the one you really want? Take your time, there's no rush, one you're interested in.
Where we moved into the last classroom in terms of photographs interpretation, they were looking at photographs in the light of their studies across several decades, from the 1920s. And on the basis of the photograph, they were interpreting the event and were also saying, on the basis of the evidence, in which decade did this happen? So that they were looking at photographs from the war. They'd looked at other evidence from the war and they were placing that in time. So again, they were placing photographs in chronological order, but they were also interpreting events.
Have a close look. Water, excellent. Look at it. And why are they putting water into that building?
It was on fire.
Good girl. What's happened to that building?
All the bricks have fell apart.
Right, if I tell you what decade it's from, will that give you a clue as to what's happened?
Yeah.
Look on, if you look behind you, don't move, just look. The 1940s. What do you think has happened? What happened in the 1940s? The war. What's happened on that photograph? Excellent. Yes, it looks like it.
I think the kind of activities we've seen today, the way the children have responded to them, they've been stimulated, they've been motivated by it, they've been learning about the past through real events, real artefacts, real people, people's recollections of the past. They should be exposed to a whole range of sources. All the sources, in fact, that the programmes of study identify, and they should be exposed to those from a very young age. One of the sources which we would perhaps say young children can't have access to are written sources. But if we structure our questioning and draw their attention to elements that they can actually read, like the date, like the name of the person who it was given to, then we can start asking questions.
Shiny ones. Oh, you've got pop-up pictures, Bradley. Now, do you know who that is on that picture? Rupert Bear, yes. Now, I saw some of you earlier when you were looking at the books, trying to find clues as to how old your books were. Has anybody found a clue in their book as to how old it is?
It's got letters.
Now then, let's have a look. There's a little plaque here in the front of the book that says Book Production War Economy Standard. And it's a book from the 1940s.
If they can understand then, now, past, present, yesterday, tomorrow, at the age of 5, by the time they get to the end of the key stage, some children will be at the stage of asking simple questions, being able to describe what they can see. Other children will ask really quite complicated questions about the past. They will be able to make judgments about the past. And I think we as teachers have to realise where the child is at and the nature of the questions that we should ask so that we can take them one step further.
The portraits at Yorkshire's Benningborough Hall, like any pictures, provide evidence of the past. Sue Morris has developed many ways of using portraits with children. She structures her activities and her questioning to enable pupils to explore the portraits at many different levels. Sue is working with 2 groups, the first from Grulthorpe Primary School. Their teacher, Anne Rooks, has already introduced them to some techniques for interpreting pictures. The children begin by observing a number of National Portrait Gallery paintings of other children.
Right, now we're going to be looking at some of the portraits in this room, and we're going to be concentrating on the idea that we were looking at before, which is that of childhood and what it was like for children in the past and families. The first thing I wanted them to do was to realise the variety of messages that are in a portrait, because many people don't realise that pictures are deliberately trying to communicate with you. That's why they were painted. Today, we only use them as a decorative thing. You put them on the wall to make the room look nice. You don't necessarily use them as a communications medium. But in the past, they were definitely trying to talk to you. What I'm going to ask you to do first is quite a challenge. You think you're up to this? Yes. I think you are, yes. I'm going to divide you up into pairs. One of you thinks up the questions, and the other one has to try and answer them. Really put the other person through it. Really ask them, you know, good questions. And if you think they haven't answered it, then push them a bit harder.
Why do you think they've got flowers in their hands? They're all the same flowers. Do you think they're related? Or do they brothers? Yeah, I reckon they're all in the same family. Right. All of them. Do you think they're rich? Probably. Do you think they're well educated? How do you think? Yes. Why?
Well, they're lucky.
What did we decide about this lady?
She looks young and she looks like she's wearing a wig. She looks royal.
She looks royal.
Yeah, she looks like a princess because of her crown she's wearing up there. And then she looks very posh. She's got the jewels on her coat. What do you think?
The next stage was to assess with them what they thought of these as historical sources. And then I gave them some factual data about the people in the portraits, such as their dates of birth, dates of marriage of parents, numbers of children, and asked them to go and look at those portraits again with this new information in their minds. And now they have to combine the implications of the data and the source in front of them.
Who do you think are the most important? Why? The girl with the blue. It's always the lad who's there. Yeah. I agree with guys. We have a change of plan, don't we?
Well, there was a picture, for instance, of Princess Anne with her son William. And at that stage, he was the only one of Princess Anne's children to have survived from birth. 16 others died. When the children first saw that picture, they realised that the boy was extremely important. Visually, the artist had wanted you to look at the boy. They realised that the mother was being very protective to him, but that was about all.
She's got fancy clothing.
When they were given additional data, they realised quite how important he was, that he was the sole survivor, and they were able to work out that he was also the heir to the throne. Now, when you went back with some facts to look at, how did you discover more about why she was so protective? Yes?
Because she'd had 17, they'd all died except for William.
That's right.
And then he died at the age of 11.
Yes. So does that make you think anything?
They might have died in birth.
Yes, they might have actually died.
They might have sort of got like a disease, bit of a disease, and it might have passed on through all of the rest of them.
That's right.
But not quite got to William.
Yes, yes.
Writers and politicians of the Kit Kat Club are the stimulus for the KS3 exercise. This time, children from Millthorpe School in York are involved. Now the range of sources is greater, and there should be progression both in quality of analysis and in breadth of reference.
Slightly a challenge in the sense that we wanted to be able to show how quite a unprepossessing set of portraits could have some relevance to the politics and society of the time. We again began by briefing the pupils on how they could get information out of the portraits quite adequately on their own, just so long as they were prepared and able to look and to question.
These paintings are not in isolation, and studying them as a group is more challenging. Pupils can generalise about the politics and society. They've also been taught to ask questions about pose and symbolism.
It's nothing really important though, is it? Because he hasn't got any uniform. He thinks it's important. Yeah.
I think it is dark cloud, because if you look at the bit just opposite his cravat there, it's like blue sky, isn't it?
Yeah.
So if he's sad, then that's one of the ways to back it up, because you've got your darkish, thundery sort of sky there.
OK, so you've examined some of these individuals in quite a lot of depth now, and I can imagine that you can tell me a great deal more about them than you thought you were going to be able to. Is that right? In the sort of work that I'm doing in front of pictures and on site, children often seem quite reluctant to write down on paper thoughts of the subtlety of which they are capable. I therefore need to be very aware of what individual children are saying. I also am able to go around and talk to them as individuals while they're working on their own, and I can get a very good appreciation then of what level they're operating. Gracious, you know, oh hello. What about, this one here? If you met him, what sort of character do you think he would be?
He looks big-headed, as if he's sort of a person who talks a lot about himself, thinks a lot about himself.
Now, is it historical fact about these people that we discovered? What is it?
They might just be posing for the painting.
That's right, but getting to know what they wanted to be thought, what sort of people they wanted to be thought, is quite difficult. So this is very useful. OK?
Time prevents our following the full session, in which the pupils use additional source material to relate their discoveries to the broader historical context. As the activity develops, so they will begin to draw conclusions about politics and society in the 18th century. Their ability to handle sources will develop in parallel with their knowledge and understanding of the period.
I think that it's a very useful resource because you can all go in very fast at a basic level, starting by observation, then moving on to comment, then moving on to evaluating your comment. It's very straightforward to build in that progression.
The amount of alcohol they consumed.
I suppose I'd like to add that it allows children a lot of freedom, a lot of enjoyment to come out to sites such as this, and they confront real historical items which give them a slight shiver, a slight sort of feeling of contact with the distant past and the famous past. And that shiver is the thing which will make them want to come back and back and back. And because I believe in valuing these sources, that's what I want too.
So what have we got to have? 11, 12, 13, 1A, 15, 16? Do we have to have that?
No, because we're just doing that straight.